Hey there. The idea of living to 200 years old probably sounds pretty appealing, but actually getting there may be more difficult than you'd think. That's because the chances of developing cancer increase as you age, and eventually it becomes a nearly universal threat. But there is hope. It turns out that some big animals like elephants, whales, and rhinos seem to be almost entirely immune to cancer, which makes them the key to the next step in the fight against this deadly disease. We have spent millions of years studying the evolution of life on Earth, yet we still don't know everything about the basic building blocks of life. Cells are the fundamental units of our bodies, the smallest structures that carry out the functions essential to life. Everything from building bones to generating energy takes place in cells or relies on signals sent between them. So if we want to understand what's gone wrong when we get sick or why we die, we have to start with these tiny powerhouses. Cells are made up of countless parts and countless chemical reactions, most notably the generation of proteins. Proteins play hundreds of roles in the human body. They make up our hair, help transport oxygen in our blood, and facilitate communication between cells. Proteins are so important that if they stop being produced properly, the cell often has no choice but to self-destruct. In order to keep everything running smoothly, our cells have a built-in kill switch that triggers apoptosis or programmed cell death. This process breaks down the cell from the inside out and recycles its parts, ensuring nothing harmful remains behind. Our cells also receive signals from the outside, telling them whether or not to commit suicide. Chemical messengers called cytokines, for instance, can trigger apoptosis if they detect any signs of trouble. But sometimes this does not work. Sometimes the biochemical networks that make proteins or respond to signals just don't fail. And when that happens, the immune system steps in as a second line of defense. Cells that can't function correctly are identified and eliminated before they spiral out of control. If both of these defenses fail, however, those faulty cells can grow unimpeded and develop into a cluster known as a tumor. Cancerous tumors invade surrounding tissues, overwhelming the body's ability to replace healthy cells. While there are many ways to treat this disease, our fundamental understanding of its roots is still lacking. And to figure out how to defeat an enemy, you have to understand how it works. Enter Peto's paradox. Animals of all shapes and sizes get cancer, but it seems that larger animals should develop the disease much more often. That's because every time a cell divides, it faces the possibility of mutation. Some mutations are harmless, while others are lethal. But even those that fall somewhere in between can cause problems. Cancer is generally thought to arise when a few of these ambiguous mutations occur, causing a cell to reproduce uncontrollably. Since cancer arises from random events, the chance of a single cell mutating in any given organism is independent of the number of cells that creature has. But the more cells in an organism, the greater the likelihood that several cells will undergo these ambiguous mutations at once. For example, mice are about 7 times smaller than humans and live for about 2 years, half as long as the average human lifespan. Given this, you might expect them to develop cancer at half the rate of people, but studies show that they develop cancer at roughly the same rate. This finding is true even down to creatures like hamsters, which are 100 times smaller and 300 times shorter lived than humans. Rodents develop cancer at rates comparable to ours. But it's not just their size that's different. Every individual cell is also smaller. To put this into perspective, a blue whale has around 30 trillion cells, but each one is 5 times larger than a human cell. This means that a whale has roughly the same amount of cell material as a human, just distributed across fewer cells. And if you think that means whales should get cancer more often than humans, you're not alone. Richard Peto, a British epidemiologist, was the first to quantify this relationship in 1977. He pointed out that cancer rates should increase with the number of cells in an organism, especially considering that bigger animals also tend to live longer. According to Peto, cancer incidence should scale with the number of cells multiplied by the number of years an animal lives. This model predicts that blue whales, with their 300 times more cells and twice as long lifespans, should suffer from cancer over 600 times more than humans. In reality, though, whales develop cancer less than 10 times as often as we do, which means they somehow defy the laws of probability. This puzzle has come to be known as Peto's paradox, and scientists have proposed a couple possible solutions, both of which could hold the key to treating cancer in humans. The first hypothesis we'll consider is the evolutionary hypothesis. Larger animals do not necessarily live longer, but all animals evolve along different trajectories. Consider the Galapagos giant tortoise. Its ancestors were ordinary tortoises that flew over from South America and evolved into giants after arriving. But the giant tortoise still faces the same risks of cancer as its relatives on the mainland. This suggests that the ability to resist cancer is an evolutionary trait that all land vertebrates developed as they grew from a few inches to full-grown adults. In this scenario, natural selection favored individuals that suppressed cancer, allowing them to reproduce and pass on their genes. According to this theory, larger animals have evolved more tumor-suppressing genes than smaller ones. In a 2014 paper, researchers looked at the DNA of 15 species representing various sizes and ages. Their analysis showed that animals with more tumor-suppressing genes also had slower-growing tumors. As a result, a whale cell would require more than 100 times as many mutations as a mouse cell to become cancerous. This means that while a whale might acquire a cancer-causing mutation every 100 times as often as a mouse, the odds of it becoming cancerous overall remain low. With all these extra layers of protection, whales and other large animals are able to avoid Peto's paradox. These tumor-suppressing genes might also explain why certain groups of animals are particularly prone to cancer. Elephants, for instance, have 20 copies of a gene called TP53, which tells cells to divide or self-destruct. Most other mammals have just 2 copies of this gene. This redundancy means that elephants can lose 18 working copies of the gene without losing all of them. This also means they have a 50% chance of surviving any given cancer-causing mutation. Humans only have 1 copy of TP53, so if we suffer a single mutation, we're unlikely to survive it. But not all animals follow this pattern. A related gene called MDM2 prevents elephant cells from making too much of the TP53 protein, keeping the whole system in check. And MDM2 has been duplicated 40 times in the genomes of some fish, enabling them to produce huge numbers of proteins that identify and repair damaged DNA. While these examples are intriguing, there's currently no evidence that gene duplication is a common anti-cancer strategy among large animals. There may be other ways that whales and their relatives evade Peto's paradox, such as changes in their chromosomes, DNA methylation, or even their sex chromosomes. These factors can alter which genes get expressed, further modifying the genetic underpinnings of cancer. But there's also another type of explanation for how large animals fight cancer, and it starts with those pesky little rodents. As part of the second hypothesis, known as the supertumor hypothesis, we need to go back to the beginning of the story. We know that cancer arises when a single cell suffers a series of mutations, but we also know that cancers are clonal, meaning they originate from a single cell. To understand what that means, imagine a city where everyone is related to one another through a complicated web of family ties. If there's a serious crime, the police can easily track down all the criminals. By tracing their lineage back to a common ancestor, biologists can do something similar with cancer cells. By comparing the DNA of cancerous cells to each other, they can identify the exact cell that gave rise to the entire tumor. But here's where things get interesting. Researchers have analyzed the family trees of several human cancers and found that despite their size, they all descend from a single ancestral cell. And this is true even for massive tumors containing billions of cells, so there must be some kind of limit on how fast cancer can grow. Once a cell starts to multiply rapidly, it's no longer like the proverbial hamster on a wheel. Instead, it's like a group of hamsters on a wheel. And the moment one of them breaks away, the rest are left behind. In fact, all it takes is one mutation for a cell to break off and start its own colony. Once it does, It's no longer competing for resources with the original cluster. This phenomenon is called cellular competition, and it turns out that all animals are susceptible to it. By growing new tumors, these breakaway cells compete for the resources their original cluster used to consume, and if the new tumor is successful, the original one starves to death. But not only does this prevent cancer from spreading around the body, it also limits the size of tumors themselves. The same mechanism that helps animals avoid metastasis also explains why small tumors are more dangerous for small animals. For instance, a 1-ounce tumor is 10% of a hamster's body weight, enough to cause severe harm. In contrast, that same tumor would be only 0.002% of a human's body weight and 0.109% of a whale's. On average, whales do not even develop cancerous tumors large enough to kill them, and that's why whales and their relatives enjoy such long lifespans without succumbing to cancer. But wait a minute. If the supertumor hypothesis is right, then larger animals should suffer from more cancers, not fewer. That's because cellular competition depends on an animal's total mass, not its number of cells. For instance, if 2 whales have the same number of cells, but one weighs more, that individual will have larger cells, meaning it also has a greater potential for runaway growth. But in reality, the opposite appears to be true. Amongst species of similar size, the more massive an animal is, the slower its cells divide. This means that the larger animal has fewer cells, making it less susceptible to cancer in the first place. So to explain this seeming contradiction, scientists propose that a third factor is at play. As animals grow, their cells get bigger, and that increased size brings with it challenges. Larger cells need more complex systems for communication, food distribution, and waste disposal. At the same time, the distance that molecules must travel within the cell increases, slowing down the exchange of materials. For this reason, larger cells have fewer mitochondria, the structures responsible for producing energy. Mitochondria are essentially the cell's power plants, and without enough of them, the cell cannot function properly. So even if large cells are more likely to become cancerous, they also have a harder time carrying out the error-riddled process of cell division. It's like trying to drive a car with a dented fender. Sure, you can keep driving, but the risk of a blowout increases significantly. Similarly, larger cells accumulate more DNA damage, increasing the chances that any given one will turn cancerous. Ultimately, the benefits of avoiding Peto's paradox come at a cost. But until we understand the downsides, we cannot hope to overcome them. That's why unraveling Peto's paradox is crucial to our quest for conquering cancer. If the evolutionary hypothesis is correct, we should try to introduce more tumor-suppressing genes into humans. But we have to be cautious of the unknown side effects. If the supertumor hypothesis is right, we might try to create therapies that reset cancer growth by inducing competing tumors that starve existing ones. Both approaches are extremely risky, and we cannot move forward without a deeper understanding of these processes. But the payoff could be enormous. By studying how large animals fight cancer, we can find new ways to prevent, detect, and treat this devastating disease in humans. So who knows, maybe the secret to living to 200 lies in the single-celled origins of life. Thanks for watching this episode.